On August 1, 1941, President Franklin Roosevelt signed an executive order that made war in the Pacific almost mathematically inevitable. He froze all Japanese assets held in American banks and imposed a total embargo on oil exports to Japan. At the stroke of a pen, he cut off 85% of Japan's entire oil supply. Japan had no meaningful domestic production. Without American oil, its navy had 18 months before it could no longer move. Its military leadership faced one choice: attack now, or surrender everything they had spent a decade building. To understand why this mattered so completely, you need to understand Japan's oil situation in 1941. Japan was almost entirely dependent on imported petroleum. Its domestic production was negligible, less than 10% of its needs. 85% came from the United States alone. The rest came from the Dutch East Indies, modern Indonesia, and a small amount from elsewhere. When Roosevelt cut the American supply, Japan's military estimated it had oil reserves for roughly 18 months of full operations. After that, the fleet stops. The planes stop. The war machine stops. The embargo was not a surprise. American-Japanese relations had been deteriorating for years over Japan's expansion into China and Southeast Asia. Roosevelt had been gradually tightening economic pressure, restricting scrap metal exports, aviation fuel, industrial equipment. The July 1941 oil embargo was the final and decisive step. What made it extraordinary was that American officials knew exactly what it would force. Ambassador Joseph Grew in Tokyo had warned Washington in 1939, cut Japan's oil, and it will send its fleet to take the Dutch East Indies. He was right. That is precisely what Japan planned. Japan's response to the embargo was not immediate. Through the summer and autumn of 1941, diplomatic negotiations continued in Washington. Japan offered conditions. The U.S. insisted Japan withdraw from China. Japan refused. The negotiations were real on the surface, but underneath, Japan's military was already planning. Admiral Yamamoto, who designed the Pearl Harbor attack, was opposed to war with America. He knew Japan could not win a prolonged conflict, but he also understood the oil clock. If war was coming regardless, attacking first gave Japan its only window of advantage. He designed the attack as a delay, not a victory. On December 7, 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. The history books focus on the surprise, the devastation, the declaration of war, but the strategic question underneath it all is one that historians still debate. Did the oil embargo make Pearl Harbor inevitable? Most serious analysts, including those in the Roosevelt administration at the time, believed the answer was yes. The embargo was a decision to force a confrontation. The only question was where and when. Japan chose the where and the when, but the oil chose that Japan would choose. On the other side of the world, Germany had its own oil crisis, and it was just as existential. In 1941, Germany controlled much of Europe, but it controlled almost none of its own oil. Its primary source was Romania's Ploiești fields, which produced significant but insufficient quantities. It had synthetic fuel plants converting coal to oil, expensive, slow, and vulnerable to bombing. And it had captured stocks from conquered territories, which were rapidly being consumed. Germany's war machine ran on borrowed time and borrowed fuel. Hitler understood this. His generals wanted to push toward Moscow, the symbolic and political heart of the Soviet Union. Hitler overruled them. In August 1941, he issued Directive 34, redirecting major forces south toward Ukraine and the Caucasus. His reasoning was explicit in the directive itself. The economic objective of seizing Soviet oil production capacity was paramount. Moscow could wait. Oil could not. His generals were furious. Field Marshal von Bock called it a strategic catastrophe. History would prove him right, but not for the reasons he expected. The southern drive was called Case Blue, Fall Blau. Launched in June 1942, it had two objectives: capture Stalingrad on the Volga River to secure the northern flank, and drive on into the Caucasus to seize the oil fields at Baku, Maikop, and Grozny. These three fields together produced roughly 80% of Soviet oil. If Germany captured them, the Soviet war machine, its tanks, its aircraft, its trucks would grind to a halt within months. It was an audacious plan, and for a time, it worked. The Soviets understood the stakes perfectly. As German forces advanced into the Caucasus in the summer of 1942, Soviet engineers were ordered to destroy the oil infrastructure before it fell into German hands. They did so with extraordinary thoroughness. When German forces captured Maikop in August 1942, they found a ruined field, wells plugged, machinery smashed, pipelines cut. German engineers estimated it would take a year to restore production. Germany never had that year. The oil it had driven hundreds of miles to capture produced almost nothing for the German war effort. The failure at Maikop was the first signal that Germany's oil strategy had a fatal flaw. It assumed the Soviets would not destroy what they could not hold. They did. Every time, methodically, without hesitation. Soviet scorched earth policy on oil infrastructure meant that German advances, even when successful, yielded empty prizes. And while Germany was chasing oil it couldn't reach, the battle that would decide the war was beginning at a bend in the Volga River, at a city called Stalingrad. Stalingrad was never meant to be the main event. In Hitler's original Case Blue plan, it was a flank protection objective. Take the city, secure the Volga, prevent Soviet reinforcements reaching the Caucasus oil campaign. But the battle became something else. What began as a securing operation became a prestige contest. Hitler's name was in the city's name, and Stalin refused to let it fall. By autumn 1942, Germany had committed the bulk of its Sixth Army to street-by-street fighting in a destroyed city, while its Caucasus oil campaign stalled for lack of the reinforcements, now tied down in Stalingrad. Stalingrad was never meant to be the main event. In Hitler's original Case Blue plan, it was a flank protection objective. Take the city, secure the Volga, prevent Soviet reinforcements reaching the Caucasus oil campaign. But the battle became something else. What began as a securing operation became a prestige contest. Hitler's name was in the city's name, and Stalin refused to let it fall. By autumn 1942, Germany had committed the bulk of its Sixth Army to street-by-street fighting in a destroyed city, while its Caucasus oil campaign stalled for lack of the reinforcements, now tied down in Stalingrad. Meanwhile, what Hitler had gambled everything on, the Caucasus oil, was slipping away. The German force that had penetrated deepest into the Caucasus, Army Group A, reached the foothills of the actual Caucasus Mountains by August 1942 and planted a German flag on the summit of Mount Elbrus, the highest peak in Europe. A photograph of that flag became a propaganda image. What the propaganda didn't show was that the army planting that flag had run almost completely out of fuel to advance further. It had reached the edge of the oil country and stopped. The German Sixth Army surrendered at Stalingrad on February 2, 1943. Field Marshal Paulus, the only field marshal in German history to surrender to an enemy, walked out of his basement headquarters into Soviet captivity. Of the 300 men encircled, roughly 91, 0 survived to surrender. Most of them would die in Soviet prison camps. The battle cost Germany not just men and materiel, it cost it the strategic initiative on the Eastern Front. Permanently, it never regained it. And it all began with an oil calculation that failed. While Germany was running out of fuel and Japan was calculating its reserves, the Allies had something neither Axis power could match: American oil. In 1941, the United States produced 63% of the world's total oil output. Its fields in Texas, Oklahoma, California, and the Gulf of Mexico were producing at levels no other nation on Earth could approach. When the war began in earnest, America simply turned the tap wider. By the peak of the war, American wells were supplying 6 out of every 7 barrels of Allied petroleum. This was not a military advantage. It was a structural one, built into the geology of the continent. That structural advantage translated directly into combat capability. Every Allied tank, aircraft, destroyer, landing craft, and supply truck ran on American-produced fuel. The logistics of WWII were fundamentally an oil logistics problem, and the Allies had solved it before the war began. The U.S. built a network of pipelines specifically for the war effort, including Big Inch and Little Big Inch, 2 of the largest pipelines ever constructed at that point, moving oil from Texas fields to East Coast ports for shipment to Britain and the theaters of war. The German Navy understood the Allied oil supply chain better than almost anyone. U-boat commander Admiral Duthenitz identified American oil tankers as Germany's primary strategic target in the Atlantic. In the early months of 1942, Operation Drumbeat, German submarines sank hundreds of Allied ships along the American East Coast, many of them oil tankers. The loss of oil tankers was, in strategic terms, more damaging than the loss of warships. A sunken destroyer hurt. A sunken tanker starved a theater of war. The Allied response to the U-boat campaign was eventually decisive convoy systems, improved sonar, long-range patrol aircraft, and code-breaking through ultra-intelligence. By mid-1943, the Battle of the Atlantic had turned in the Allies' favor. But the lesson was not lost. The oil supply chain was the most critical infrastructure of the entire war. Protect it and you maintain the capacity to fight. Lose it, and no amount of industrial output or military planning can compensate. This is why the U.S. Navy's priority in the Pacific was not sinking Japanese warships. It was cutting Japan's tanker routes. By 1944, the U.S. submarine campaign had severed Japan's tanker fleet so thoroughly that Japan's home islands were being starved of the oil they needed to maintain basic industrial and military operations. Japan's aircraft carriers were still afloat, but they could not be fueled to steam. Its aircraft were flying on fuel mixtures progressively degraded with pine root oil as petroleum ran out. The country that had started the war to secure its oil supply had, through the war, been completely cut off from oil. The embargo of 1941 had been replaced by the submarine blockade of 1944. The result was the same. If oil was the decisive resource of WWII, then oil infrastructure became the decisive target. The clearest example is Plosti, Romania, the refinery complex that supplied roughly a third of Germany's processed fuel. Plosti was one of the most heavily defended targets in Europe. And on August 1, 1943, the U.S. Army Air Forces sent 177 B-24 Liberator bombers to destroy it in a single low-level raid. Operation Tidal Wave. The Plosti raid became one of the most costly and celebrated missions in American military history. It was also one of the most tactically catastrophic. The Plosti raid was planned as a surprise attack at low altitude to evade German radar. It was not a surprise. German and Romanian air defenses were fully prepared. The bombers flew into a wall of anti-aircraft fire and fighter interception at treetop level. Unable to evade, unable to climb, unable to abort. Of the 177 aircraft that set out, 54 were lost. Over 500 American airmen were killed or captured. 5 men received the Medal of Honor, the most awarded for a single mission in American history. The damage to the refineries was significant, but Plosti was back to near full production within weeks. The Plosti experience and subsequent raids on German synthetic fuel plants taught the Allies a critical lesson. Oil infrastructure is remarkably resilient when attacked once. It takes sustained, repeated bombing to permanently reduce production. By 1944, this lesson had become doctrine. The U.S. Army Air Force's oil plan, championed by a young economist named Walt Rostow, targeted German fuel production systematically, month after month. By early 1945, Germany's fuel production had fallen by 60%. Its aircraft were grounded not by enemy fighters, but by empty fuel tanks. The oil targeting strategy was one of the most consequential decisions made by Allied planners in the entire war. It was also contested at the time. General Eisenhower and Arthur Harris, head of RAF Bomber Command, both initially prioritized other targets. The oil plan was eventually implemented over their objections, primarily through the advocacy of Eisenhower's deputy, Air Marshal Tedder. The historical verdict is largely clear. When the oil campaign finally became the priority, it accelerated the end of the war by months, possibly by more. The German army began running out of fuel for tanks and trucks before the final Allied advances in 1945. The lesson of WWII, written in the records of every major campaign, Pacific, Eastern Front, North Africa, Western Europe, is the same. The side with the oil supply chain wins. Not necessarily the side with the better generals, the braver soldiers, or the more advanced technology. The side that can fuel its machines, month after month, across every theater simultaneously. That side wins. In WWII, that was the United States. And the United States knew it. Before we close, I want to bring this back to the present, because the strategic logic of WWII's oil war did not end in 1945. What you are watching in today's US-China rivalry over Taiwan, semiconductors, and rare earth minerals is structurally identical to what Roosevelt did to Japan in 1941. Identify the resource your rival cannot do without. Control its supply. Force a choice, accept strategic limitation, or escalate. The instrument has changed. The logic is the same. Understanding 1941 is the fastest way to understand 2025. WWII also established something that shaped every episode in this series from that point forward. American oil supremacy created American strategic supremacy. The country that emerged from the war as the dominant global power was also the country that had supplied the fuel for the entire Allied effort. That was not a coincidence. It was a structural relationship. Oil production capacity and geopolitical power moved together in the 20th century. Understanding that relationship is the foundation for understanding the 1973 embargo, the petrodollar, the Gulf Wars, and the de-dollarization debate happening right now. This is episode 3 of our series on oil and world power. In episode 4, we move into the Cold War, where American and Soviet oil strategies collide across 3 decades of proxy conflict. The U.S. uses oil access as the central tool of its Middle East policy, building its relationship with Saudi Arabia into the most consequential bilateral energy arrangement in history. The Soviets used their Siberian oil fields to fund the arms race and prop up client states. 2 superpowers, 2 oil strategies, and the world caught between them. If this episode changed how you understand WWII, if you can now see the oil calculation underneath Pearl Harbor, the fuel logic behind Stalingrad, and the production advantage that made D-Day possible, then you already understand more about the modern world than most people ever will, because that logic never stopped. It just put on different clothes. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because the story doesn't end here, it evolves. Episode 4 is where the Cold War begins, where the US-Saudi relationship is forged in secret, and where the modern Middle East starts to take the shape we recognize today. You do not want to miss it.